I have a joke that I have not been able to find a way to tell, and it doesn't fit with anything we're talking about, but I want to tell it, so we'll just start there. For fear that a whole nother Sunday will pass and somebody else will get it. This is the story of a little boy, and he was looking around the church that he attended, and he saw in the foyer a plaque, a metal plaque, and there were all these lists of these names of all these men, and by every man there was a little American flag. And the pastor was nearby, and the little boy said to the pastor, "What are all these names? Why are all these names listed here?" The pastor says very seriously, "These are the names of all the men who were part of this church who died in the service." And the little boy says, "The 8:30 a.m. or the 11 a.m.?" So, some friends and I were talking last night about the pilgrimage trips that David and I and Durga and Vidura, friends of ours, used to lead to India. We did it for over about 20 years. We took about 12 different trips and took some hundreds of people to India. That was before Ananda had a center over there. So those pilgrimage journeys were one of the first ways that a lot of Ananda people were able to go to the shrines that were holy to Master. And the last trip that we took, we were having a little trouble filling it up, so we announced it as the last one we were going to do, and then everybody came in. And now that we've begun to miss taking those journeys, we were thinking of having a reunion tour, you know, the way that you can keep, yeah. Well, that wasn't actually a totally serious suggestion, but that was a good response, because those were really glorious adventures. We took sometimes as many as 50 people, which was way too many. But about 30 was the good number. Sometimes especially at the beginning when we didn't know how to keep people well, and we were going up to Kashmir and discovering that the bottled water that they were serving us was actually filled in the lake and then capped and handed to us, which is the same place that the sewage was running. And so a lot of people got sick, but let's not go there. They don't anymore, because we don't go to Kashmir because it's too dangerous. And we started dealing with the bottled water. But sometimes people would get very ill at that point, and we'd always suggest, we had two answers. One is that the motto of our trip is that we'd never lost a pilgrim. Not once. No one had ever died on our trip, and we were going to keep our record. And secondly, they say that if you die in the city of Varanasi, you will be liberated by Shiva. So at least encourage them to hold on till Varanasi, because then at least they'd really get something out of their experience. I mean, we had a lot of adventures in letting go on those trips, because especially when we first started traveling, India is much easier to travel in now, but when we first started traveling, as our tour guide put it, he said everything functioned about a half inch above the ground, so if anything went wrong, the whole thing would crash. When we encouraged him, maybe he wanted to come live in America, he said, "Oh, it's no fun in America, everything works." He said, "India's much more exciting, you know, because you never know what's going to happen in any case." And I was laughing on one of our very first pilgrimage trips. It was actually Krishnadas, many of you know him. He's a lovely man, he's very, very fastidious, extremely exact about everything he does. It's a positive aspect of his nature. So when he went on this pilgrimage journey, he had absolutely everything figured out, practically to the ounce in his suitcase, every article of clothing perfectly. He had new sandals, everything was just set. And we were flying over on the plane from San Francisco, and as it happened, fortunately it was me, because he was a little caught that I was the one who did it. Just very early, the stewardess served me a glass of orange juice. I did not do it on purpose. I swear I didn't do it on purpose. But I turned and I poured it all on his shoes. So he started out his whole journey, you know, with his shoes. And for him, for other people, it's like, who cares? For him, this was a real tapasya. Those perfect sandals were now filled with orange juice. And nothing could be done about it. And I had done it. So it was hard for him to be very, very angry at me. You know, but this is sort of the journey that all of us are on. A pilgrimage trip is a unique opportunity, especially the way we would run them, because the four of us put out a great deal of energy to make sure that everything was taken care of, so that the people who were traveling could just let go of all the things that we normally think about. Where am I going? What am I going to do? How are we going to get there? What are we going to eat when we get there? What if we're late? What if something like this happens? Where is my luggage? You know, all those different questions. After a time, both with our experience and then their experience with us, people got to relax on levels of the mind that you don't even realize are occupied. That so much of our attention is always going to just sort of holding this world, this disintegrating world, at bay. Krishnadas he's been a very good sport about it since then. You know, you put out all this energy to go, and the first thing that happens is me pours orange juice on your shoe. By accident, pure accident, but nonetheless, that God just takes a hand in it. And no matter how we have our world set up, it's just never really going to quite work like that. I remember a woman who has children. She has 2 daughters, and when her daughter was in mid-high school, her daughter was having a very serious emotional experience, and the mother was trying to sort of get into the reality of what was troubling her, and very sensitive mother-daughter moment. Finally, the daughter confesses that she really realizes that she has heavy thighs. For teenage girls in America. And this is how she's built. There's really nothing she's going to ever be able to do about this. She's never going to have these skinny thighs. And here's this woman, this young woman, just facing the end of everything at the age of 15. And the mother has to take it seriously. You can't just say, "Oh, my dear, that's ridiculous." Because from the teenager's point of view, it's far from ridiculous. And there's this whole reality that all of us are always living through, which is that we have this hope. We have this aspiration. There's a very interesting section of the lessons that I'm using to give classes on Tuesday night. This is Swami Kriyananda in 1950 was put in charge of the monks at the ashram where Yogananda lived, Mount Washington, and he wrote a series of lessons that he trained the monks in discipleship. I'm using that same course on Tuesday night to give classes. All of you are welcome. But he's also talking to these monks who have left their ordinary way of life, and they have entered this monastic order, and obviously that life was a formal monastic order in 1950, and so their lives were destined to look very different. His hope in training them is to give them the strength and the right understanding that they'll be successful in the life that they're going for. But of course, sometimes we start out in one direction and life takes us in another. But he was talking about what happens to a devotee once you have seriously embraced the idea of God realization, but then find that you're not really quite able to hold on to it. There's many different answers to that question. In the Bhagavad Gita, the disciple Arjuna asks Krishna that very question, very realistic question, when you sort of parse through the poetry of it. Arjuna says, look, worldly life at least gives you a little pleasure for a little while, and if I renounce all of that self-aggrandizement and try this noble search for God, but I end up without God either, I've given up that and I don't have this. This doesn't look like a very good bargain to me. And Krishna answers with great compassion, because it's a very real fear. With great compassion, Krishna refers to the fact that the soul goes on, and that even though the individual jiva, which is our individual spiritual self, puts on the costume of one incarnation after another, each time it takes the costume of this body off, nothing happens to the spirit inside. It just keeps going on and then takes on another costume and another. And so Krishna says to Arjuna, the phrase is, my devotee is never lost. Merely because you aspire and don't reach perfection doesn't mean that all that sincere intention goes nowhere. And then he describes what happens in the next incarnation and the next, which is you simply start at the point that you had reached. So even if perfection isn't in front of you, you don't fall all the way back to the beginning. You start where you were and you go on from there. And in this way, over many, many incarnations, eventually we come to where we're going. And one of the reasons that you don't fall all the way back is what Swamiji was describing in this course of lessons. And this was the thought. He said a great deal of satisfaction, when we're looking outside ourselves for that satisfaction, is in the hope that if I carry forth in this way, then I will be happy. If I can get into the good school, if I can get the good grades, if I can get a position with this company, if I can work hard enough to make partner, if I can marry this particular woman in this particular status, if I can have that home, then I'll be happy. And it's in the anticipation and the hope of a fulfillment that I'm not having now, but I will have then. That's how the material world entices us. In fact, Yogananda describes it, that is the force that causes us to reincarnate. If life was an absolute disaster every time, we really would not be that eager to come back. But we think it was a disaster only because, and if I can just straighten out this little piece, then it's going to feel entirely differently. It's that always looking to the future and not understanding two things that are vital. One is that whenever it is, it's now. It's just always now. Those of us of a certain age are very impressed to discover that it's still now and that it doesn't feel that different than being a child. When you're a child and you look at older people, you're just absolutely certain that their reality is totally different than yours. And that when you're there, you're going to be something so other than you are. And then when you are there, you aren't. You just are. I mean, if you follow what I mean. In other words, and then the more you live on the spiritual path, the more you begin to understand that the only thing I'm ever experiencing is my consciousness. That all the conditions around me simply persuade me one way or another that this is how I'm supposed to feel. But all I ever feel is who I am and what I am. And the whole process of being a devotee is really so simple. Yogananda put it in an astonishing way. He said, take care of the minutes, and incarnations will take care of themselves. When I first heard that, it seemed like so out of proportion. Because from where we stand, the incarnations seem really, really long, don't they? They seem to just go on for a really long time. I asked Swami Kriyananda, a question came up in a discussion group. Paramhansa Yogananda apparently said that he consciously remembers his individuality evolving from lower to higher forms of consciousness all the way back to the point when he was a diamond. He was a crystal, like the stones that I wear. These are not diamonds, but these are crystal stones. And crystals have, especially gemstones, have a certain consciousness that you can feel. Yogananda says he remembers being a diamond. I mean, that in itself makes your mind kind of tilt over. So someone asked the obvious question, how do you ever get out of being a diamond? Like, what happens next? Do you go into being an emerald? Do you get to be like then a granite rock? Do you then go from there to being a redwood tree? And how long does it take? You know, really, like, how long does it take? They seem to me like very interesting questions. I'd never, ever thought of those questions. So I had the opportunity to visit Swami Kriyananda, and I asked him, he was eating breakfast, so he was sort of trapped. I asked him, asking all this, and his answer was just even took the whole thing to another dimension. He said, compared to eternity, all time is nothing. The evolution from a diamond to a self-realized master, compared to eternity, all time is nothing. And that just sort of begins to make us appreciate that we're on to something that's really a little bit beyond the mind to answer, isn't it? Now, then I sort of pressed my question and asked him, sir, well then how do you get out of being a diamond and where do you go from being a diamond? And sweetly, but firmly, he looked at me and he said, these are ridiculous questions. And the reason he said that is, what difference would it make? And that's sort of how he gauged it. And I said, I don't think they were ridiculous. I thought they were interesting. I mean, he was teasing me. I thought they were interesting. But then he said, what difference would it make? What difference would it make how long you've been or where you are or whether a diamond becomes a redwood tree? He said, the problem that we're all facing, he didn't explain it because I knew what he meant, but the problem that we're all facing is now. The problem that we're all facing is precisely 100% how do we feel right in this moment. And what Swamiji was saying compared to eternity and so on, you see, we only have one choice. Either we allow ourselves to be influenced in such a way that we begin to contract into all of the considerations that bind us when the jiva, when the infinite individuality becomes identified with the limited. And if you really think about everything that makes you suffer, it's the degree to which you have allowed your infinite individuality to become identified with that which is always fluctuating. I don't have enough money, I don't have enough friends, I don't have a comfortable place to live, my body is not functioning anymore, my thighs are too heavy and they will never be thin. You know, just every single reality, if you stop for a moment and analyze it, compared to eternity, compared to the consciousness of the infinite, does this even exist? And if it existed, what would it mean? Haridas had this wonderful, he took from a phrase of Master's. Master said, when they make a movie of a great man's life, even a great man, if they make a good movie about it, it lasts maybe 2 hours. You know, maybe a really long movie would be 2.5, maybe 3. And you would see the whole scope. Years ago, the movie Gandhi was so fantastic, and we watched that movie many times, and it was quite long. But you got the whole scope of this man's life and birth, death, assassination. It was just such a magnificent spectacle. Ben-Hur, you know, all these movies that are so great, even if they're long. But think about it. Your whole life can be summarized. I mean, like ours would probably be only 90 minutes. You know, it just wouldn't take that long. And so whatever section you're in, Haridas used to say, I think that maybe this is going to warrant maybe 30 seconds in the movie. You know, maybe it's like, we think it's so big, but and then when it's past, it's just past. And all that we're ever experiencing is where we are in the present moment. Now, all of spiritual practice is the training to be able, no matter what assaults you, to not allow it to persuade you that now I'm justified in letting go of my infinite self. And you see, this is what our commentary says today. Every level of consciousness has its own attractive power. Swamiji was talking once, he was driving across the Bay Bridge, and that was during the period of time when he was teaching every night in order to earn the money to buy the first land that became Ananda Village. He was exceedingly busy, had commitments all day, every day. There was just no margin in his schedule. And he said he started across the Bay Bridge and he felt a cold, the germs of a cold. He just felt them enter into him, just all of a sudden like that. And he had 2 impulses. The first impulse was, as he put it, to relate to those germs. The germs have arrived. I have to think about how I feel. I have to consider their power over me. I have to get into the wavelength that those germs are, because every level of consciousness has its own attractive power. And the other impulse was the one he expressed. And in a very loud voice, alone in his car, he said, "Get out, get out, get out, get out," just like that. It was like, I don't have to relate to you. I just have to get rid of you. And he said, and he just felt them retreat, just like that. You know, if somebody unpleasant comes in your door, you don't have to sit down and talk to them. You can just say, get out of my house. And if you don't get out, I'm going to call the police. You don't have to relate to them. Even if they try to tell you, you have to relate to me. You don't have to. That's part of the delusion. In fact, that's the biggest part of the delusion, is that it persuades you that you should relate to it. Where really the only thing we ever have to relate to is that infinite power within us. That there is nothing, as Master put it, that we should allow to get our goat of peace, to upset us, to take away from us our faith in our infinite reality. Now, all of spiritual practice, again, is telling us all the different ways in which we can train ourselves to do that. We can meditate, we can chant, we can serve, we can pray, we can be artistic, we can be a hermit, we can be a social person, we can raise children, we can earn money, we can do anything that we want to do if we do it with that consciousness of being a channel for the infinite for the sake of our own spiritual salvation. There's no aspect of our lives that is any farther or nearer to divine consciousness. It is made so only by the consciousness that we have while we do it. And all of the spiritual exercises are to give us the strength in bringing our consciousness back. That's what meditation does for us, you see, because in meditation, you clear away all distractions. And what you get to practice is the pure capacity to overcome all contrary influences and keep our consciousness at the spiritual eye and keep our awareness of God's presence. And even if we're not perfect at it, the constant repetition, even of trying to do that, gradually builds in us this ability that whenever distractions come, whether they come in meditation or in other circumstances, we've trained our consciousness to come back to that. The energization exercises, which are often not sufficiently appreciated as a spiritual practice, uses the physical body, which is much easier to access, in order to train the concentration and the will. I will in this moment send energy to my right forearm, and I will send lots of energy to that right forearm. And then when you first start, you think, where is my right forearm? You send energy to your right forearm and your left wrist starts twitching over here. Because we're not, as Master said, omnipresent even in our own bodies. We don't know where we are and who we are. All of life is just, all of spiritual life is just bringing that focus back. And in that context, you have to understand, and this is what the Gita is trying to tell us today, the Bhagavad Gita is trying to tell us, there's no success or failure in this, because it's just a matter of learning how to herd this energy and move it forward. We're so charmed by that joke I told at the beginning where the little child just puts a completely different interpretation on what's said to him. And it doesn't make it any more true that he misinterpreted it. We just think it's really adorable how he misunderstood. Well, in truth, that's exactly who we are to Divine Mother. We're out here and we have these ideas about things. You give the child a present sometimes, and the child's more interested in the cardboard box that it came in. If it was an interesting cardboard box, can't tell the difference. And so Divine Mother is always showering us with the gift of divine consciousness. But we get very confused. And we think that whereas what we're really experiencing is our inner consciousness, we believe it comes from this new couch, this beautiful piece of clothing, this particular person, this baby which is mine. And it's not as if those are not gifts that we should be grateful for. It's not as if those are inappropriate exercises for us. But what we have to understand is we have to always be realizing that everything that happens to us is one exercise. When one first gets on the spiritual path, you can have a tremendous interest in many aspects of it. People like to go to astrologers, and sometimes they go to psychic readers, and various things which are not necessarily a bad thing to do, and often can be very helpful because they help sort out the confusion in our minds. They help us see the patterns of our lives. They help us understand why we respond in certain ways that don't make any sense. Why would I feel this way about this person whom I just met, either positive or negative? And when you get a perspective on the longer cycles of time and what may have happened before, how you're inclined, all of these things, in a way, can be useful to you. But sooner or later, we sort of realize that it's all just the same. that all the specific events of this specific being and all the different adventures it had assume what Yogananda describes in Autobiography of a Yogi, which is such a magnificent piece of wordsmithing. He says that all after a while assumes a certain anguishing monotony. That's just, those two words, anguishing monotony. I mean, isn't that just the worst? You know, even as we say, tragedy at least is exciting. You know, you have the tension of what is going to happen here and the necessity to garner your forces. Anguishing monotony is much, much worse. And when you really look around and see what makes people with aged bodies old, it isn't really the aged body that makes them old, it's the anguishing monotony of the whole thing that makes them old. They become, as Master described, psychological antiques. The brain just can't go any farther and it just freezes up. It knows what it thinks about everything. And it uses the marvelous phrase, that reminds me of a story. You know? In other words, no living in the now. Only living in the construct that we've already created. That's the anguishing monotony of it. And that's very interesting because Yogananda's definition of Satchidananda, which is God, ever existing, ever conscious, ever new bliss. Isn't that an interesting phrase? Ever new bliss. And so it's not enough to just sort of settle into your basic bliss, you know? Although a lot of us would settle for the basic bliss, right? You have to have the ever new bliss, the extra firm. I was trying to buy tofu the other day. Do I want super firm or do I want extra super firm? Do I want the extra super firm tofu? You know, so I bought them all and just sort of bounced them to see which one was the right one. It's like, how can you tell from the words? It goes the other way too. We were making a group order of some clothes, and we ordered the same exact garment last year. And this year, they're trying to make all us women feel more delicate. Exactly the same sizes have all moved down one. So where you were medium before, my goodness, now you're a small. Isn't that wonderful? It's just so, crazy. Isn't it crazy? You know, just this constant, desperate effort to just make it, paste it on from the outside. Just pasting it on here, pasting it on there, pasting it on here, paste it here. When all we ever have is our consciousness. And it's not only monotonous, it's just such a sense of defeat. Because no matter how hard we try, it's a moving river. And even if we can get it just all organized finely, just exactly so. I mean, when you finally even actually get it all set, then comes global warming. You know, it's like something will happen that is just going to shift it out of your control. And if you are accustomed to just standing in the moment with that sense of ever new, well, where are we and what's going to happen now? When we would go on our pilgrimage trips, that was one of the consciousnesses that you would be able to get into, even us who were in charge of it. You know, it was just like, well, where are we now and what's going to happen now? Because not having any responsibility for anything, there was no point in thinking of past or future. It was just, where are we now and what's going to happen now? But you see, life is really like that anyway. Because all we can ever attend to is what's here right in front of us. Now, our Bhagavad Gita verse today is one of the most beautiful verses in the Gita, both in the poetry of it and also in the meaning of it. What Krishna is saying to Arjuna in this one, Arjuna is saying, how do I live for you? How do I arrange my life so that I can live up to this high ideals? So Krishna starts by saying, be constantly aware of God's presence within. And however, if you do find that a little tricky, like you might find that a little tricky, okay, then do those practices and those rituals which will help you to remember that God is within you. You know, do your pujas in the morning, do your kriyas in the morning, do your energization exercises, do all those things which by their very nature will help you remember. And gee, if you find that a little bit tricky, and you can't quite hold yourself to the discipline of those practices, well then do good works. Do serviceful things. Take care of your family. Tend to your home. Work for a divine cause. And if you can't do any of that, tithe some of the money you earn at the other job that you're in order to help the divine cause. In other words, let your work, your activity be for God. And if even in this, thy faint heart fails you. That's how Edwin Arnold puts it. Isn't that sweet? If even in this your faint heart fails you, then he says, bring to me your failure. And it's just, what a glorious, glorious spiritual teaching compared to you do this or you go to hell. You're part of this group or you're damned forever. Only the Catholics get to heaven, or Baptists or Protestants or whoever they are. They're the only ones, or the chosen people. Whatever it is. Instead, Krishna says, do this or this or this or this or this or this or this. And if none of these work for you, then just bring your complete, helpless, blubbering nothingness and put that on the altar. You know, like every one of us has that, right? And he really, Edwin Arnold says it beautifully, but and Swami then, Edwin Arnold's is a poetic translation. When Swami gives a more literal translation in his essence of the Bhagavad Gita, he says, what you bring to God is your intention, your desire to be good, you know? And of course, you won't even be thinking about God if you don't somewhere in some part of you have a desire to be good. And even if all you have is this horrible, useless, completely embarrassing behavior and the desire to be good, what God says, okay, here's the fitting offer, your desire to be good. And then you drag behind it all the rest of the stuff, you know? But it just doesn't make any difference. You see, darkness tries to persuade you, oh, now that I've failed, I have to relate to how I failed. Now that I haven't lived up to my aspirations, I have to settle in and contemplate how I failed to live up to my aspirations. Master says, bundle the whole thing up and just put it on the altar. Because all we ever have is the moment. Once it's past, it's past. And if we keep telling ourselves a story about it, then it lives on. But just bundle it all up and give it to the divine. And then you have the moment after that. If you can find joy in the moment, Yogananda says you have God. Those are his two statements that relate to this. Take care of the minutes, the incarnations will take care of themselves. If you can find joy in the moment, then you have God. Don't make this complicated. It is challenging, but it's not complicated. All the details are completely irrelevant. It makes no difference. It's an ever-changing, incredibly creative, oh so fascinating parade that tells you you're supposed to relate to it. But you're not. You're just supposed to say, okay, Divine Mother, things are going great, let's be happy. Okay, Divine Mother, things have never been worse, let's be happy. Because God is with us as much in every circumstance and in every moment as He ever will be. The choice is only what we choose to relate to. God bless you.